Have you ever wondered what it truly means to age gracefully and maintain your independence, even as the years stack up and life's challenges seem to grow? In today's video, we're diving into the incredible story of Grandfather Park, a remarkable 70-year-old who defied conventional expectations of elderly care to find his own unique path to a fulfilling and independent life. By the end of this video, you'll have gained powerful insights into the realities faced by many seniors today, from emotional struggles to daily practicalities, and you'll see how creative thinking and genuine human connections can shape a life worth living, even in the twilight years. Grandfather Park's journey is not just inspiring, it's also a reminder of the deep value in human connection, resourcefulness, and the little choices we make that can redefine our experiences. You'll hear about the profound bond he built with a young couple, a relationship that offered him the companionship he needed, without compromising his autonomy. So, stick around, because this heartfelt exploration of resilience, community, and aging well might just change the way you think about growing older. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and activate the notification bell so you won't miss any future videos that could make a real difference in your life. As we start, I'd love to hear from you. If you like the topic of this video, comment 1 below. If not, comment 0 and let me know how I can make better content for you. Your support means a lot to me, whether it's liking, sharing, or commenting. It all helps us continue spreading valuable lessons. Now, let's jump into the story. At the age of 70, Grandfather Park found himself reflecting deeply on the different living arrangements he'd experienced over the years. He'd tried living with his children, employing a caregiver, and even staying in a nursing home, but none of these options felt right. Each left him feeling unsatisfied, yearning for something more fulfilling in his golden years, something that could bring him both comfort and a sense of autonomy. After a lot of soul-searching, and by a stroke of luck, he stumbled upon a living situation that finally made sense to him. It allowed him to embrace his independence while also providing a sense of security. This new chapter was one he has happily continued to this day, much to his relief and joy. Grandfather Park recalls, "I turned 70 this year, and the years leading up to my 75th birthday were filled with challenges I never imagined. When my beloved spouse was still with me, I felt a deep, unshakable sense of security. We promised each other that we'd always be there, especially during times of illness. I remember our hospital visits. We would laugh and find joy in even the most uncomfortable moments, just because we were together. But when she passed away, everything changed. Suddenly, the thought of going to the hospital felt daunting, like a dark cloud hovering over him. Without his partner by his side, every hospital visit became a lonely, exhausting ordeal. Despite having a son and daughter who loved him dearly, Grandfather Park avoided asking them for help. He feared becoming a burden, and this well-intentioned independence often backfired, leading to situations where his children, despite their busy lives, had to take care of him more than he'd ever wanted. Things reached a critical point during a routine trip to the market. He stumbled, fell, and ended up in the hospital. The doctor said he needed at least 6 months to recover. After the accident, his children proposed a new plan. He would alternate between staying at his son's and daughter's homes, spending 3 months in each. On paper, it sounded like a good idea, a way for his children to keep him close and ensure he was cared for. But in reality, it was far from ideal. He couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider in their homes. There's a saying that resonated deeply with him: a parent's home is always the child's home, but the child's home can never be the parent's home. No matter how much they tried to make him feel welcome, he couldn't escape the feeling of being a guest, an intruder in their busy lives. He longed for his own space, a place where he truly belonged. If you're still with me and finding value in these lessons, please comment 1 below. It lets me know that you're here, that you're part of this journey with us. Eventually, Grandfather Park found a new living arrangement that brought him peace. It wasn't just about having a roof over his head. It was about finding a place where he could retain his dignity and enjoy the independence he cherished. Living with his children, though a generous gesture on their part, had left him feeling more alone than ever. He recalled the many days when he would eat meals alone in his room, listening to his children's laughter coming from the kitchen, a reminder of the distance between their worlds. There were moments when he would be asked to prepare his own meals, and though he tried to comply, it often felt like a dismissal, as if his presence was an inconvenience. "It's not that they didn't love me," he explained, "it's just that their lives were full, busy, and different from mine. I couldn't help but feel like I was being left behind." The loneliness he experienced was unlike anything he'd felt before. Even the smallest interactions became reminders of his growing isolation. After 6 months of moving between his children's homes, Grandfather Park decided he needed to return to his own place, a modest home filled with memories and the comfort of familiarity. Though small, it represented his autonomy, his memories, and everything that made him feel like himself. But returning home also meant facing the harsh realities of his declining health. His recent leg injury was a constant reminder of his vulnerability, making even simple tasks like grocery shopping feel impossible. In an attempt to regain some control, he hired a caregiver. But the financial strain was immediate. The monthly cost of $500,000 was more than his pension, and he couldn't help but feel guilty for burdening his children financially. Their contributions, a modest $10,000 each month, helped cover the cost, but it was clear that this situation wasn't sustainable. He accepted his reality. His meals were simple, frugal, and far from the nourishing dishes enjoyed in wealthier households. Caregivers often left after only a few days, unable to adjust to the modest conditions, and agencies hesitated to send anyone, knowing they wouldn't stay long. With no consistent help available, Grandfather Park found himself considering options he'd hoped to avoid. The thought of moving into a nursing home weighed heavily on him, but it seemed like the only viable solution. Eventually, he did enter a nursing home, a place that was far from the comfortable setting he'd hoped for, but at least it was affordable. It wasn't ideal, but it allowed his children to be free from the financial burden of his care, which brought him some comfort. However, life in the nursing home was difficult. It felt suffocating, with rigid routines and a lack of personal freedom. After a month, he knew he couldn't stay. Leaving the nursing home was like a breath of fresh air, a chance to reclaim his independence, however fragile it might be. He returned to his small home, resuming his life of solitude. But just as he was settling back in, a new convenience arrived that changed everything. An online grocery shopping service became available in his area. Grandfather Park began asking his daughter to order groceries online for him, which he could then pick up from a small mart conveniently located at the entrance of his apartment complex. It was a blessing. No longer did he have to walk far, and the relief was immediate. His legs hurt less, and he felt a renewed sense of control over his life. The young couple who ran the mart were kind and observant. They noticed his struggles and offered to carry his items up to his apartment. Over time, their small acts of kindness blossomed into a genuine friendship. They became a bright spot in his day, offering not just help, but also warmth and human connection. This comfortable routine continued for 6 months, but despite the newfound stability, Grandfather Park couldn't shake the anxiety about what lay ahead. As he aged, he became increasingly aware of his declining strength, and with it came an unsettling fear about the future. How much longer could he live independently? Would he always be able to rely on the kindness of others? The uncertainty weighed heavily on him. One day, as he made his way to the mart, he overheard the young couple arguing. Their words revealed the strain of financial struggles, a reality that resonated deeply with him. The wife was defending her decision to buy a treat for their child, while the husband expressed concern about their finances. Their conversation was a stark reminder of how many families live on the edge, and Grandfather Park felt a deep sense of empathy. In that moment, an idea sparked in his mind, an idea that could help both him and the young couple who had shown him such kindness. He decided to propose an arrangement. He would pay them $200,000 each month if they would come to his house daily to help with a few essential tasks. It was a modest amount, but enough to make a difference for them, and it would allow him to maintain his independence. He reassured them that he only needed simple meals, and that the work wouldn't take much of their time. At first, the couple hesitated. They were embarrassed to accept money from someone they considered a friend, but Grandfather Park insisted. He emphasized that he genuinely wanted to help them, just as they had helped him. Eventually, they agreed, and a beautiful new chapter began for all three of them. Living with the young couple marked a turning point for Grandfather Park. The arrangement wasn't just about practicality, it became a source of comfort and joy that neither party had expected. The couple visited his house every day to help with cooking and cleaning, but beyond that, they brought life back into Grandfather Park's quiet, solitary home. Their laughter echoed in the small apartment, turning a once silent space into a home filled with warmth. The young couple would arrive early in the morning, the wife often carrying a small basket of vegetables or fruit, while the husband would immediately start chatting with Grandfather Park. They'd tidy up his living room, do the laundry, and prepare meals, all while engaging in lighthearted conversations. Over time, these moments became the highlight of Grandfather Park's day. The young man often spoke about the challenges of running the small mart, sharing stories of interesting customers or funny mishaps that had happened during the day. It made Grandfather Park feel connected to the world outside, as if he was part of the larger community again. One day, as they were cleaning up after lunch, Grandfather Park asked the couple to sit down for a moment. He looked at them with gratitude in his eyes. "You two are like the grandchildren I never had," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't think you realize how much joy you've brought into my life. I was feeling so lonely before you came along." The young couple smiled, and the wife reached over to place her hand on his. "Grandfather, we feel the same way. You're like family to us." It was a simple statement, but it meant the world to him. Though the work they did was light, it gave Grandfather Park something he hadn't realized he needed: a routine, a sense of purpose, and most importantly, human connection. In return, the young couple found an elder who genuinely cared for them, who listened to their worries and offered advice when they needed it. They were surprised by how much they had come to depend on his wisdom and calm demeanor. He shared stories from his youth, tales of hardship, love, and resilience that offered them perspective and comfort. It was a bond that grew deeper with every passing week. The husband once told Grandfather Park about his struggles making ends meet. The small mart was barely keeping afloat, and the expenses for their young child were starting to add up. It was something he wouldn't normally share with others, but with Grandfather Park, it felt natural. The old man listened intently, nodding as he heard the young man pour out his worries. He thought about his own life, how he had faced similar challenges when he was younger. He couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility to help this young family, who had done so much for him. He reassured the young man, "Things will get better, my boy. You're doing all the right things. Just hang in there." One afternoon, after a particularly busy day at the mart, the young wife brought her little daughter to visit Grandfather Park. The small child, no older than 3, was shy at first, hiding behind her mother's legs. But Grandfather Park had a way with children. He bent down, his old joints protesting slightly, and smiled at her. "Hello there, little one. Do you want to see something special?" He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small wooden bird that he had carved years ago. He wound it up, and the bird began to flap its wings gently. The little girl's eyes widened, and a smile broke across her face. Slowly, she let go of her mother and took a step toward him. From that day on, the little girl became a regular visitor. She would sit on Grandfather Park's lap while he told her stories or showed her how to draw simple shapes on old pieces of paper. Her laughter filled the apartment, and for Grandfather Park, it was like a piece of his old life had returned. He had always loved children, and having the little girl around made him feel young again, even if just for a while. Grandfather Park's days started to take on a comforting rhythm. He'd wake up early, make himself a simple breakfast, and wait for the couple to arrive. They'd clean, cook, and share stories, and then, in the afternoons, he'd rest. The evenings were his favorite. Sometimes, the young husband would bring over his guitar and play a few songs, while his wife hummed along. Grandfather Park would close his eyes and listen, letting the music wash over him. It reminded him of the times he and his wife used to sing together when they were young. It was a nostalgia that brought both joy and a bittersweet ache to his heart. Despite the happiness this new chapter brought, Grandfather Park couldn't ignore the nagging thoughts in the back of his mind. He was getting older, and his health wasn't improving. He knew that eventually, he might need more help than the young couple could provide. He didn't want to be a burden on them. But for now, he chose to focus on the present, on the warmth of the young family, on the laughter of the little girl, and on the music that filled his evenings. There was one particular day that stood out for Grandfather Park. It was a cold winter morning, and the young husband arrived with a steaming pot of soup. He set it down on the table, and the smell of herbs and spices filled the small apartment. "Grandfather, my wife made this special for you," he said, smiling. "It'll warm you up." As they sat down to eat, Grandfather Park felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He looked at the young couple, busying themselves with serving the soup, and he realized that this was what he had been searching for all along, not just independence, but a sense of belonging, of being cared for, and of caring for others in return. He leaned back in his chair, letting the warmth of the soup and the company wash over him. "You know," he said, his voice soft, "I've lived a long life, and I've seen many things. But I think this right here might be the happiest I've been in a long time." The young wife looked up, her eyes filled with emotion. "We feel the same way, Grandfather. You've made our lives so much richer." The bond that had formed between them was unlike anything Grandfather Park had ever experienced. It wasn't based on obligation or duty, it was built on genuine care and affection. The young couple didn't see him as a burden, they saw him as part of their family. And for Grandfather Park, that made all the difference in the world. As winter turned to spring, the small garden outside Grandfather Park's apartment began to bloom. The young couple helped him plant flowers, bright marigolds and daisies that added color to the otherwise gray building. The little girl loved to water them, giggling as she splashed water everywhere, often drenching herself in the process. Grandfather Park would sit on a small stool, watching her, a smile playing on his lips. It was in these small moments that he found true happiness, in the laughter of a child, in the kindness of friends, and in the beauty of a simple life well lived. As time went on, Grandfather Park began to think more about the future. He knew he couldn't avoid it forever. He sat down with the young couple one evening, the setting sun casting a golden glow through the window. "I want to talk about something important," he began, his tone serious. The couple exchanged a glance, their expressions turning attentive. "I'm not going to be here forever, and I want to make sure that when the time comes, things are as easy for you as possible." The young wife shook her head, her eyes welling up. "Grandfather, don't talk like that. We're here for you, no matter what." He smiled gently, reaching out to pat her hand. "I know, my dear. And that's why I want to make sure everything is planned out. I don't want you to have to worry about anything." He then shared his plan to leave them the little savings he had, as a way to thank them for all they had done. The young husband tried to protest, but Grandfather Park insisted. "It's not much, but it's what I have. You two have been my family, and this is my way of giving back." The couple eventually accepted, tears streaming down their faces. It was a bittersweet moment, filled with love and a deep sense of connection. They promised him that they would continue to care for him, no matter what, and that they would honor his wishes. It brought Grandfather Park a sense of peace, knowing that he had people who genuinely cared about him, who would be there for him until the very end. The days continued, filled with the simple joys of shared meals, blooming flowers, and quiet evenings spent in each other's company. Grandfather Park knew that he was nearing the end of his journey, but he was no longer afraid. He had found what he had been searching for, not just independence, but a community, a family, and a sense of belonging that made every day worth living. As the months went by, Grandfather Park settled comfortably into his routine with the young couple. The days were filled with small but meaningful moments, each one adding color to the otherwise simple life he led. The little girl became a constant source of joy, her laughter echoing throughout the small apartment, and Grandfather Park often found himself smiling just at the thought of her bright face. Her curiosity and innocence brought him a sense of lightness he hadn't felt in years. One particular day, as Grandfather Park sat in his chair watching the young wife prepare lunch, he found himself reminiscing about his youth. "You know," he began, his eyes distant, "when I was a young man, I used to dream of traveling the world. I wanted to see places beyond what I had read in books." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "But life had other plans for me. Family, work, responsibilities, they all kept me close to home." The young wife looked up, curious. "Where would you have gone, grandfather? If you could have gone anywhere?" He paused, a wistful smile touching his lips. "I always wanted to see the mountains of Switzerland. I've heard they're magnificent, soaring peaks, covered in snow, and the air so crisp it takes your breath away." He sighed softly, as if picturing it in his mind. "But I suppose I've come to realize that sometimes, it's not about where you go, but who you have with you. The people around you can make even the simplest place feel extraordinary." The young wife nodded, her eyes warm. "You're right, grandfather. It's not the places we go, but the memories we make with the people we love." Grandfather Park smiled, feeling a sense of contentment settle over him. He hadn't traveled the world, but he had experienced love, loss, and the kind of connection that mattered most. That evening, after dinner, the young husband brought out his guitar once again. He played a soft, gentle tune, and the little girl danced around the room, her tiny feet moving clumsily in circles. Grandfather Park watched, his heart full. He leaned back, closing his eyes and letting the music carry him. It was in these moments that he realized how lucky he was to have found a place where he was loved, where he belonged, even in his later years. The bond between Grandfather Park and the young couple continued to grow. They had become more than just neighbors or helpers, they had become his family. They shared everything, from their happiest moments to their worries and fears. One evening, the young wife shared her concerns about their financial situation. The mart was struggling, and they were unsure if they could keep it running much longer. The stress was wearing on them, and they didn't know what to do. Grandfather Park listened carefully, his brow furrowed in thought. He understood their struggles all too well. He had faced similar challenges when he was younger, trying to provide for his family with limited resources. He reached over and patted her hand gently. "You two have been so kind to me," he said softly. "And I want you to know that I'll do whatever I can to help you. You're not alone in this." The young couple was touched by his words. Though he didn't have much, Grandfather Park offered them the one thing he could, his unwavering support. He suggested they look into expanding their offerings at the mart, maybe bringing in some fresh produce or specialty items that would attract more customers. He even offered to help with some of the work, though they both laughed at the thought of him lifting heavy boxes. Still, they appreciated his willingness to be involved, and his ideas sparked a renewed sense of hope in them. One afternoon, Grandfather Park decided to visit the mart. He hadn't been there in a while, and he wanted to see how things were going. When he arrived, he was greeted warmly by the young husband, who was restocking shelves. The mart was small but well organized, with shelves lined with essentials, rice, noodles, canned goods. Grandfather Park walked slowly through the aisles, taking in the familiar smells and sounds. It reminded him of the small shop he used to run with his wife many years ago. They had worked side by side, serving their neighbors and building relationships that lasted a lifetime. He made his way to the counter, where the young wife was ringing up a customer. She smiled when she saw him. "Grandfather, what brings you here today?" He smiled back, leaning on his cane. "I wanted to see how my favorite mart is doing. And maybe buy a few things while I'm here." She laughed, shaking her head. "You don't need to buy anything, Grandfather. You're always welcome here, even if you don't spend a single one." He chuckled. "Well, I'll buy something anyway. It'll make me feel useful." He picked up a few items, some rice, a can of tea, and a small pack of sweets for the little girl. As he handed over the money, he felt a sense of pride. He might not have been able to travel the world or accomplish grand feats, but he had built relationships that mattered, and that was more than enough for him. As they walked back to his apartment together, the young wife spoke up. "You know, Grandfather, we've been thinking about what you said, about expanding the mart. We're going to give it a try. We're going to bring in some fresh produce and see if that helps." Grandfather Park nodded, his eyes lighting up. That's wonderful news. I'm sure it will make a difference." He paused, looking at her earnestly. "And remember, I'm always here to help, in whatever way I can." The young wife smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion. "Thank you, grandfather. You're always looking out for us. We're so lucky to have you." Grandfather Park shook his head gently. "No, my dear. It's I who am lucky. You've given me more than you could ever know." As they approached the apartment building, they saw the little girl playing near the entrance, her face lighting up when she spotted them. She ran towards them, her arms outstretched. "Grandfather," she squealed, wrapping her tiny arms around his legs. He laughed, patting her head gently. "Hello, little one. I've got a surprise for you." He reached into his bag and pulled out the small pack of sweets, her eyes widening with delight. "Thank you, grandfather," she said, her voice filled with excitement. Later that night, as they all sat together in the small living room, the young husband began strumming his guitar again. This time, he played a more upbeat tune, and the little girl clapped along, her laughter filling the room. Grandfather Park watched them, his heart swelling with affection. He had spent so many years feeling like a burden, feeling disconnected from the world around him. But here, with these people who had become his family, he felt alive again. He looked around the room, at the faces of those he had grown to love, and felt a deep sense of peace. He knew that no matter what the future held, he wouldn't face it alone. The young couple had given him more than just a helping hand, they had given him hope, companionship, and the kind of love that made every day worth living. If you're enjoying this story and want to hear more about Grandfather Park's journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Your support means the world to us. And if this story has touched your heart, please like this video and leave a comment below. Let me know you're here, and share your thoughts, they truly help us create more content that speaks to you. As spring turned to summer, the young couple's efforts to expand the mart began to pay off. The fresh produce brought in new customers, and the little shop started to thrive. Grandfather Park watched with pride as the couple worked tirelessly, their faces filled with hope and determination. He knew how much it meant to them, and he was grateful that he could be a small part of their success. One hot summer day, as they all sat outside on the small bench near the garden, the young husband turned to Grandfather Park. "You know, grandfather, we couldn't have done this without you. Your advice, your support, it's meant everything to us." Grandfather Park smiled, his eyes twinkling. "I've done nothing but share a little wisdom from my own experiences. The hard work, that's all you." The young wife nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Still, you've given us so much more than we could have asked for. You're like a guiding light in our lives." Grandfather Park felt his heart swell with emotion. He had never imagined that, at this stage in his life, he would find such fulfillment, such joy. He had always thought that growing old meant fading into the background, becoming invisible. But here he was, surrounded by people who loved him, who valued him, and who saw him for who he truly was. The little girl, who had been playing with her toys nearby, looked up and smiled at Grandfather Park. "Grandfather, are you happy?" she asked, her innocent eyes wide and curious. He looked at her, his heart full. "Yes, my dear," he said softly. "I am very, very happy." As the sun set that evening, casting a golden glow over the small garden, Grandfather Park realized that he had found what he had been searching for all along. It wasn't about independence, or freedom from burden. It was about love, connection, and the simple joy of being part of something greater than himself. He knew that, whatever came next, he was ready. He had lived a good life, and he had found a family when he needed it most. And for that, he would always be grateful. As the summer days grew longer, Grandfather Park found himself more deeply intertwined with the young couple's life. The little girl had started calling him Grandpa with a sense of ownership, and it warmed his heart. He embraced this title, feeling a renewed sense of purpose each time her tiny voice called out to him. It had been a long time since anyone had called him Grandpa, and it was a role he cherished deeply. One afternoon, as they sat outside under the shade of an old tree, Grandfather Park noticed the young husband looking particularly worn out. His shoulders were slumped, and there was a distant look in his eyes. Grandfather Park turned to him and asked gently, "What's weighing on your mind, my boy?" The young husband looked at him, his face softening. He sighed and said, "It's just, sometimes it feels like no matter how hard we work, we're always just one step away from falling behind. The mart is doing better, but it's still tough to keep up with all the expenses." Grandfather Park nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility that seemed to press down on the young man. "You know," he began, "when I was your age, I used to feel the same way. There were days when I thought I couldn't keep going, that the burden was just too much to bear. But then I realized that life isn't about winning every battle, it's about staying in the fight, about waking up every day and trying again." He paused, giving the young husband a warm smile. "And look at what you've built. You've got a family who loves you, a business you're working hard to grow, and a community that values you. That's no small feat, my boy." The young husband looked at him, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He nodded, a small smile breaking across his face. "Thank you, Grandfather. I guess sometimes I just need a reminder of what really matters." Grandfather Park reached over, giving his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "We all do, my boy. We all do." That evening, the young wife prepared a special dinner, a dish that Grandfather Park hadn't had in years. It was a simple stew, filled with fresh vegetables and tender meat, seasoned with a blend of spices that reminded him of his childhood. As they sat around the small table, the young wife explained, "I made this because I remember you telling us about the meals your mother used to make for you when you were young. I wanted to try and recreate it for you." Grandfather Park was deeply touched. He took a bite, the flavors instantly bringing back memories of his mother's kitchen, the warmth of her smile, and the love she poured into every meal. He looked at the young wife, his eyes misty. "It's perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've done something very special for me today. Thank you, my dear." The young couple smiled, and the little girl, unaware of the sentimentality of the moment, clapped her hands in delight. "More stew," she giggled, and they all laughed, the warmth of the evening wrapping around them like a comforting blanket. As summer slowly turned into autumn, the air became crisp, and the leaves began to change color. Grandfather Park found joy in the little things, watching the young husband rake the leaves into piles while the little girl jumped into them with abandon, her laughter ringing out like music. He loved the sight of the young wife hanging freshly laundered clothes in the cool breeze, her face serene and content. These moments, simple as they were, made him feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. One day, the young husband came to Grandfather Park with an idea. "Grandfather, I've been thinking. You've got so much wisdom, so many stories to tell. What if we recorded them?" Grandfather Park looked at him, surprised. "Recorded them?" he asked. The young husband nodded enthusiastically. "Yes. We could record your stories and share them online. I think a lot of people could benefit from your experiences, just like we have. Plus, it would be a way for us to preserve your stories for the little one when she grows up." Grandfather Park was hesitant at first. He wasn't used to technology, and the idea of speaking to a camera felt strange. But the young husband was persistent, and eventually, Grandfather Park agreed. They set up a small corner of the apartment with a comfortable chair and a simple backdrop, and the young husband brought out his phone to record. The first time they filmed, Grandfather Park was nervous. He stumbled over his words, unsure of what to say. But the young husband encouraged him, reminding him that it was just like the conversations they always had. Slowly, Grandfather Park began to relax. He spoke about his childhood, about the lessons his parents had taught him, about the struggles and triumphs of raising a family. He shared stories of love and loss, of joy and sorrow, and as he spoke, he found himself growing more comfortable, more confident. The young husband edited the videos and posted them online. To their surprise, people began to watch. Comments poured in from strangers who were touched by Grandfather Park's stories, who found comfort and wisdom in his words. The young husband showed Grandfather Park the comments, and he was overwhelmed. "I never thought anyone would care to hear an old man's ramblings," he said, his voice filled with emotion. But the young husband shook his head. "They're not just ramblings, grandfather. They're lessons. And people need them." The videos became a regular part of their routine. Once a week, they would sit down, and Grandfather Park would share a new story. Sometimes, it was about his youth, other times, it was about the lessons he had learned in his later years. The little girl would often sit on his lap, listening with wide eyes, her presence adding a special warmth to the recordings. It was a way for Grandfather Park to connect not only with his newfound family but also with people beyond the walls of his small apartment. The response from viewers was incredible. People shared their own stories, their own struggles, and thanked Grandfather Park for his wisdom. It gave him a sense of purpose, a feeling that even in his old age, he could still contribute something meaningful to the world. The young couple was thrilled, and they often spoke about the positive impact the videos were having on others. One day, as they were filming, a comment came in that caught Grandfather Park's attention. It was from a woman who wrote, "I haven't spoken to my father in years, but after watching your videos, I realized how much I've missed him. I'm going to call him today. Thank you for reminding me of what's important." Grandfather Park read the comment aloud, his voice breaking slightly. He looked at the young husband, his eyes glistening. "I never thought I'd be able to make a difference like this," he said softly. The young husband smiled, his own eyes misty. "You're changing lives, grandfather. Just by being yourself." Autumn continued, and with it came cooler nights and the scent of wood smoke in the air. The young couple began preparing for the winter, stocking up on supplies and making sure the apartment was warm and comfortable. Grandfather Park helped as much as he could, enjoying the sense of purpose it gave him. They worked together, the little girl toddling around with her small broom, trying to help sweep the leaves. One particularly chilly evening, after they had finished filming a new video, the young wife brought out a small box. She handed it to Grandfather Park, her eyes shining with excitement. "We wanted to give you something, Grandfather," she said. Grandfather Park looked at the box, then at the young couple, his heart swelling with emotion. He opened it to find a beautifully knitted scarf, in rich autumn colors, deep reds, oranges, and browns. He ran his fingers over the soft yarn, his eyes misty. "Did you make this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The young wife nodded. "I wanted you to have something to keep you warm this winter. You've given us so much, Grandfather. This is just a small token of our appreciation." Grandfather Park wrapped the scarf around his neck, feeling the warmth of the yarn and the love behind the gesture. He looked at them, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, my dears. This means more to me than you could ever know." The young husband picked up his guitar, and they spent the rest of the evening singing songs, the little girl dancing around the room, her laughter filling the space. Grandfather Park leaned back in his chair, his new scarf wrapped snugly around his neck, and watched the scene before him, a family, his family, gathered together in warmth and love. As they sang, Grandfather Park realized that, in this small apartment with these people who had become his family, he had found everything he had ever needed. The warmth of their love, the joy of their laughter, and the sense of belonging they had given him, it was all he could ever ask for. And as the first snow of the season began to fall gently outside, he knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. As winter settled in, Grandfather Park's days grew quieter but no less fulfilling. The young couple continued to visit daily, bringing with them warmth and laughter that filled his small apartment. The scarf they had gifted him stayed wrapped around his neck, its vibrant colors a reminder of their care and affection. Even on the coldest days, when the wind howled outside and the windows frosted over, the warmth of their friendship kept the chill at bay. One particularly cold morning, Grandfather Park woke to find a thick blanket of snow covering the world outside. He looked out the window, the landscape transformed into a winter wonderland, and smiled to himself. He knew the young couple would be by soon, and he had something special planned for them. He shuffled over to the small cabinet in the corner of his living room, opening it to reveal a box he hadn't touched in years. Inside were old photo albums, filled with memories of his youth, his family, in his life before he had moved into this apartment. When the young couple arrived, bundled up against the cold, they were greeted by the sight of Grandfather Park sitting at the table, the photo albums spread out before him. The young wife looked at him curiously. "Grandfather, what are these?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity. Grandfather Park smiled warmly. "These are my memories," he said, patting the cover of the top album. "I thought today might be a good day to share some stories from my past, the kind that aren't recorded in our videos." The young husband and wife exchanged glances before pulling up chairs on either side of him, their eyes filled with anticipation. The first album was from his youth. The photos were faded, their edges worn, but the memories they held were vivid in Grandfather Park's mind. He pointed to a picture of a young boy, standing proudly beside an old bicycle. "That's me," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "That bicycle was my pride and joy. I saved up for nearly 2 years to buy it. I used to ride it everywhere, to school, to the market, even to visit friends in the neighboring village." He chuckled softly. "I felt like I could go anywhere on that bicycle. It was my first taste of freedom." The young wife leaned in, her eyes wide. "You look so happy, Grandfather," she said. He nodded, his smile softening. "I was. Life was simpler then. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that was enough." They turned the pages together, each photograph sparking a new story. There was a picture of Grandfather Park as a young man, standing beside a beautiful young woman. "That's my late wife," he said, his voice growing tender. "We met at a festival. She was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. I remember being too shy to talk to her at first. But she smiled at me, and that gave me the courage I needed." He paused, his eyes growing misty. "We spent 50 wonderful years together. She was my partner in everything, my confidant, my best friend. I miss her every day." The young husband placed a comforting hand on Grandfather Park's shoulder. "She sounds like an amazing woman," he said softly. Grandfather Park nodded, a bittersweet smile on his face. "She was. She had a kindness that touched everyone she met. I see a lot of her in you too, that same willingness to help others, to bring light into people's lives." They continued through the albums, each photo bringing laughter, nostalgia, and sometimes a few tears. The little girl, who had been playing nearby, eventually climbed onto Grandfather Park's lap, her tiny fingers pointing at the pictures, asking questions in her innocent way. "Who's that, Grandpa?" she asked, pointing at a picture of Grandfather Park with a group of young men, all dressed in military uniforms. "Those are my friends from when I served in the army," Grandfather Park explained. "We were all so young then, full of dreams and hopes for the future. It was a difficult time, but we looked out for each other. We became like brothers." He sighed, his gaze distant. "Many of them are no longer with us, but I'll always carry their memory in my heart." The young wife listened intently, her eyes glistening. "Thank you for sharing these memories with us, Grandfather. It's like we're getting to know you all over again." Grandfather Park smiled, his heart swelling with affection. "I'm glad I could share them with you. Memories are meant to be kept alive, and they mean so much more when they're shared with people who care." As the afternoon turned into evening, the young husband stood up and went to the kitchen, returning with a tray of hot tea and a plate of snacks. They sat together, sipping tea and continuing to talk about the past, the warmth of the conversation making the cold winter day feel cozy and bright. Grandfather Park felt a deep sense of peace. He had always worried that his memories would fade away, forgotten and unshared. But now, seeing the interest in the young couple's eyes and the curiosity of the little girl, he knew that his stories would live on. A few days later, the young couple had a surprise for Grandfather Park. They arrived with a large package, wrapped in brown paper. The young husband set it down on the table, grinning. "We've got something for you, Grandfather. We thought it might help keep your memories alive." Grandfather Park looked at them, intrigued. "What is it?" he asked. The young wife gestured for him to open it. With careful hands, Grandfather Park untied the string and pulled back the paper to reveal a beautiful leather-bound scrapbook. On the cover, embossed in gold letters, were the words Grandfather Park Story. He opened it to find pages of his photographs, lovingly arranged, with spaces left for more. There were also pages for writing, where he could add his thoughts and stories in his own words. Grandfather Park was speechless. He ran his fingers over the pages, his eyes misty. This is wonderful," he said, his voice trembling. "Thank you, my dears. You've given me something truly special." The young husband smiled. "We thought it would be a good way for you to keep all your memories in one place. And maybe, one day, the little one can read it and learn about all the amazing things you've done." The little girl looked up at Grandfather Park, her eyes wide. "Grandpa, can we put more pictures in it together?" she asked. He smiled, nodding. "Of course, my dear. We'll fill it with all the memories we make together." The rest of the winter was spent doing just that. The young couple would bring over their camera, and they'd take pictures together, pictures of Grandfather Park reading to the little girl, of the young husband playing his guitar, of the young wife cooking a warm meal. They filled the scrapbook with not just old memories, but new ones, moments that captured the love and joy that filled their days. One snowy afternoon, as they sat together adding a new photo to the book, Grandfather Park looked at the young couple, his heart full. "You know," he said, "I used to think that growing old meant that life's best moments were behind you. But you've shown me that's not true. You've given me a new chapter, one filled with love, laughter, and meaning. And for that, I will be forever grateful." The young wife reached over, squeezing his hand gently. "We're the ones who are grateful, Grandfather. You've taught us so much, about life, about love, and about what really matters." The young husband nodded in agreement. "You've become such an important part of our lives. We can't imagine our days without you." Grandfather Park smiled, his eyes glistening. "Then let's keep making memories together," he said. "Let's keep filling this book, in our hearts, with all the love we can." If you've enjoyed Grandfather Park's journey so far, please make sure to like this video and leave a comment below. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us share these stories with even more people who might need a little warmth in their lives. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next part of this heartfelt journey. As the winter days slowly gave way to the first hints of spring, the warmth that filled Grandfather Park's home seemed to reflect the change in the seasons. The scrapbook sat on a shelf where he could see it every day, a testament to the love and memories they had created together. He knew that, no matter what the future held, he would always have these moments, moments that made every day worth living, moments that reminded him that it was never too late to find happiness. And as the first flowers began to bloom outside, Grandfather Park felt a sense of renewal. He may have been old, but his heart was filled with the same wonder and hope he had felt as a young man. Surrounded by his new family, he knew that life, even in its later years, could still be beautiful, still be full of surprises, and still be filled with love. As spring began to bloom in full, Grandfather Park found himself spending more time outdoors. The garden outside his apartment complex, once barren under the winter frost, was now alive with color. The young couple helped him plant flowers, vibrant tulips, daisies, and even a few herbs that the young wife used in her cooking. Grandfather Park enjoyed the feel of the soil beneath his fingers, the scent of fresh earth and growing things. It made him feel connected, not only to the present but to all the years that had come before. One warm afternoon, Grandfather Park sat in the garden with the young husband, the two of them resting after planting a new row of flowers. The young husband looked over at Grandfather Park, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Grandfather, have you ever thought about what you want your legacy to be?" he asked. Grandfather Park leaned back, his eyes closing as he let the sun warm his face. "My legacy," he repeated softly. "I suppose I used to think of legacy as something grand, something that would leave a mark on the world. But as I've grown older, I've realized that it's not about doing something big. It's about the small things, how you make people feel, the love you share, the lives you touch." He opened his eyes, turning to look at the young man. "If I can leave behind love, kindness, and a sense of connection, that's enough for me." The young husband smiled, nodding. "You've certainly done that for us, grandfather. I think a legacy like that is more valuable than anything else." As the days grew longer, the little girl began to spend more time playing outside. She loved running through the garden, her laughter filling the air, and Grandfather Park found great joy in watching her. She would bring him little gifts, flowers she had picked, small stones she found interesting, or leaves that caught her eye. To her, these were treasures, and to Grandfather Park, they were priceless. One day, she came running over with a small handful of dandelions, her eyes shining with excitement. "Grandpa, look! I brought you flowers," she said, her voice full of pride. Grandfather Park took the dandelions from her, his heart swelling with love. "Thank you, my dear," he said, placing them in a small vase he kept on the garden table. "These are the most beautiful flowers I've ever received." The little girl beamed, and Grandfather Park knew that, in moments like these, his life was filled with more beauty and joy than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't the grandeur of distant adventures or the wealth he had once thought important, it was the laughter of a child, the warmth of a family, and the simple pleasures of a life well lived. As the season continued, the young couple decided to host a small gathering for their neighbors, a spring celebration to bring everyone together. They worked tirelessly to prepare, cooking dishes from their small kitchen, decorating the garden with colorful lights, and setting up a long table where everyone could sit and enjoy the food. Grandfather Park watched them, his heart full of admiration. Their generosity and willingness to bring people together was a gift, one that reminded him of his late wife and her love for hosting gatherings. On the day of the celebration, the garden was filled with people, neighbors who had come to enjoy the food, the company, and the warmth of community. Grandfather Park sat at the head of the table, a place of honor that the young couple had insisted upon. He looked around at the smiling faces, the children playing in the grass, and the young couple bustling about to ensure everyone was well fed and happy. The young husband stood up, tapping his glass to get everyone's attention. "Everyone, thank you for coming today," he began, his voice carrying over the gentle murmur of the crowd. "We wanted to celebrate the arrival of spring, but more importantly, we wanted to celebrate the people who make this community so special. And today, we also want to honor someone who has become incredibly important to us, Grandfather Park." He turned to look at Grandfather Park, his eyes filled with emotion. "You've brought so much wisdom, warmth, and love into our lives. We can't imagine our days without you, and we're so grateful to have you here with us." The crowd clapped, and Grandfather Park felt tears welling up in his eyes. He stood, his legs a little shaky, and looked around at all the people gathered there. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you all for welcoming me into this community, for making me feel like I belong. I've lived a long life, and I've seen many things. But I can honestly say that these last few years, here with all of you, have been some of the happiest of my life." He paused, looking at the young couple, the little girl, and then at the neighbors who had become his friends. "It's not about what we have or what we achieve," he continued. "It's about who we share our lives with, the love we give, and the kindness we show. That's what makes a life truly meaningful. And I'm so grateful to have found that here, with all of you." The applause that followed was warm and genuine, and Grandfather Park sat back down, his heart full. The rest of the afternoon was spent in laughter and conversation, the sun setting slowly behind the trees as the garden lights began to twinkle in the growing twilight. The little girl climbed onto Grandfather Park's lap, resting her head against his chest as she grew sleepy, and he wrapped his arms around her, feeling a deep sense of contentment. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and the neighbors began to leave, the young couple sat with Grandfather Park at the garden table, the three of them sharing a quiet moment. The young wife looked at him, her eyes filled with affection. "Grandfather, I think today was perfect," she said softly. "It felt like a celebration of everything that matters most." Grandfather Park nodded, his gaze sweeping over the garden, now empty but still glowing with the remnants of their gathering. "It was perfect," he agreed. "Not because of the food, or the decorations, but because of the love that was shared here today. That's what makes it truly special." The young husband reached over, placing his hand on Grandfather Park's. "We're so grateful for you, Grandfather. You've made our lives richer, and we hope you know just how much you mean to us." Grandfather Park smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. "And you've given me something I never thought I'd find again, a family, a home, and a reason to wake up every day with a smile." As the stars began to appear in the sky, the young husband picked up his guitar, strumming a soft melody. The young wife sang along, her voice gentle and soothing, and Grandfather Park closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. It was a moment of pure peace, a moment that captured everything he had come to cherish about his life with them. As the final notes of the song faded into the night, Grandfather Park opened his eyes, looking at the young couple and the little girl, now asleep in her mother's arms. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for everything." If you've enjoyed this journey with Grandfather Park, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment below. Let us know what touched your heart the most. Your feedback means the world to us, and it helps us continue to share stories like this one. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss any future stories that might bring a little more warmth into your life. As the night deepened, Grandfather Park knew that he had found something truly special. It wasn't just about finding independence or overcoming the challenges of old age, it was about finding love, connection, and meaning in the simplest of moments. And as he sat there, surrounded by the people who had become his family, he knew that his journey, though winding and filled with its share of heartache, had led him exactly where he was meant to be. The next morning, as the first light of dawn touched the garden, Grandfather Park woke with a sense of peace. He looked at the scrapbook on his shelf, now nearly full of memories old and new, and smiled. He knew that his story wasn't over yet, there were still more memories to make, more love to share, and more moments to cherish. And with the young couple and their little girl by his side, he was ready to embrace whatever came next, one beautiful day at a time.